Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Modern Brewer podcast. We are back and we'll be hitting you with regular bi-weekly episodes on how to become a better brewer. Last episode, we discussed nitrogen generation and how it can solve our purchased CO2 addiction. The other solution is carbon recapture. That episode will be with two members of Dallam, Frederick and Kim, and a real-life user to talk us through what really changed for them. Before we start this episode, I have to make a huge shout out to the guy on the tube who spotted me, came over as his stop was up and said, "Keep up the good work with the podcast." It really made my day, week, month, year, and I really wanted you to know how nice it was to hear. So just thank you so much. In this episode, we're going to be talking about everyone's favorite topic, hops. The most expensive commodity in modern day brewing, hops have become the flagship ingredient in craft beer. And I could cite probably hundreds of resources on their origins, their flavors and aromas, their impact on fermentability, and the different types they come in. But where do you find out information on the hop market itself? This is actually a question I had back after the first episode of the Modern Brewer podcast was released on hop contracting. I was looking around going, I just want to know more about the hop market as a whole. And then I found my answer. Douglas MacKinnon has provided an impartial macroeconomic view of the hop market from the MacKinnon Report on Substack. Tying in his experience as a former hop merchant himself, he has a PhD in agricultural economics and is an entrepreneur. Doug has given a new perspective on how the hop market really operates and why the price for hops has risen so drastically and consistently despite the actual current surplus of hops that exist. In my opinion, Doug is one of the best writers in the brewing industry. You literally have to check out the MacKinnon Report on Substack. And for the first time ever, Doug is going to be discussing his future plans with the MacKinnon Report. I hope everyone enjoys this episode. We actually ended up talking for such a long time. And usually my goal is to edit the episodes down to sort of sub-hour episodes or around the hour mark. But I find everything so fascinating, I'm releasing it in full. So move over, Stephen Bartlett and the Diary of the CEO. Welcome to Douglas MacKinnon's Diary of a Former Hop Merchant. Okay, so welcome to the show, Douglas MacKinnon.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. This is the first podcast I've ever done, so a little nervous, to be honest, but I'll try to do my best.
Well, no problem. This is only my 15th, I think, so we just a lot.
Yeah, but I've listened to a few of them, and you're pretty good.
I appreciate it, man.
I
Yeah,
enjoyed 'em.
it's been a lot of luck, really, getting involved in some excellent guests that have really helped me out. So, hey, look, Doug, I've been a big fan of your writings for a long time. But I mean, for the listeners who probably don't know who you are, can you just give who you are and kind of what you do?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so well, like you mentioned, I've been writing these articles on hops and the hop market and how the hop industry works for about 18 months now. It started in mid-2020, but I began working in the hop industry at the end of 1999. So yeah, I really show my age on that one. But I started as the director of Hop Growers of America, and I did that for 5 or 6 years or so. And then I at that time, I started a different version of the MacKinnon Report, which is what my current articles are written under on Substack. But back then, so this was like 2005, 2006, there wasn't the social media that we have today. And it was a lot harder for people to know what was going on in different parts of the world, even just, as far as production of hops goes. And I had all these contacts with breweries and growers all over the world. And so I'd spend about half my time traveling back and forth between Europe between April and October, and so it was a very different report. It was more like what's happening, what's going on. If there was a storm, I'd be there and I'd get pictures and interview some farmers and talk to key people to figure out what the impact of that might be, that sort of thing. But now everybody can follow everybody else on Instagram. And if there's a storm in Slovenia, for example, everybody knows about it within an hour. So that type of thing is not really necessary anymore. But I've always loved writing. And so I just enjoy the process. And I don't know, maybe that's why people enjoy reading it, because I really do enjoy writing them, and it doesn't feel like work. So it's kind of therapeutic for me in a way, but it sounds ridiculous, but talking about hops. But yeah, so after that version of the MacKinnon Report, like I mentioned, I was kind of everywhere all the time. And that put me in the right place at the right time. I guess could be the wrong place at the wrong time. In 2007, when the big hop shortage happened. And I knew where there were a bunch of hops and knew brewers who needed them. And so that's when I turned to the dark side and became a hop merchant. And I did that for probably, 15 years, 12 or 13 years. It didn't end so well. Kind of crashed and burned, but actually it's been a blessing in disguise. Since then, I've gone on to get my PhD in agricultural economics, and my dissertation was the effect of proprietary hop varieties on the U.S. hop market between 2000 and 2020. And the reason I chose that, I mean, that sounds very, very specific, now that I say it out loud, but what's happening, or what happened during that time, is the market changed from being filled with completely public varieties. Well, almost. I mean, if you have to go back to like 1998 or 97 to have totally public varieties. But around 2000 was around the time when the USDA, the Department of Agriculture here in the US, started reporting the number of proprietary varieties that were being produced in the Pacific Northwest. So Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. That kind of didn't take off right away, but there was, I don't know all the details about this because it was before my time in the hop industry, but there was, the varieties Columbus, Tomahawk, and Zeus.
Mm-hmm.
There was a big scandal around them in the late 90s. And all I know is what I've heard from, second, third hand. So I couldn't really speak to the details of the scandal, but I know that when I started in the industry, the merchants were all suing each other over who owned those varieties. And at that time, those were all proprietary varieties. Each company thought they owned the rights to the variety, and the trade names are different, but the variety turned out to be the same, from what I understand. And they were spending a lot of money suing each other. And I think that demonstrated the value of proprietary varieties in the hop industry for the first time ever. Back then, it was all about who can produce more alpha per acre. It wasn't about flavors and that sort of thing, although they were paying attention to flavors. I think Citra was actually developed in the late 90s. But flavor wasn't the thing everybody was looking for, because it was an alpha game, at least here in the United States at the time. So the flavors were, sounds kind of funny to say in hindsight, but it was kind of like a byproduct almost of what they were really looking for, which was greater efficiency on the farm, produce more for less. And that's because back in the day, hops were really, hops were treated as a commodity because alpha was the main component that everybody was looking for. And there was really no way to differentiate that at the time. And that's significant because that's, I would say, the biggest thing that's changed in that 20-year period that I studied in my dissertation is hops changed from being a commodity product to being a product that's differentiated. And by brand, by flavor, by, well, who owns it, who controls it, all those sorts of things. And that's a huge change to an industry that has always been a commodity industry. And that wasn't an accident, for sure. I mean, the people that are involved in the hop industry today there's some really, really smart people. Yeah, they knew what they were doing when they started the breeding programs back in the 80s. That was around the time when Monsanto started their breeding programs, because I think it was like 81 or something, the Reagan administration made it legal to patent plant life. And of course, with hops, it takes like 10 years to create a new variety. So there weren't any results right away. But as it developed between, let's say, 2000 and 2010, it became a lot more obvious the value of the branded varieties, like Citra, Mosaic, Simcoe. Simcoe's a great example because it was one of the first ones that took off. And of course, Citra dominates the industry now, and Mosaic's super popular too. But I think it started to become apparent then the value that branding varieties would have, but not to everybody. And then when the craft beer explosion happened here, things just took off. And that changed. I mean, it was those people who owned those varieties were in the right place at the right time. Not to say they got lucky because they're super smart, but there's an element of luck to it also. Yeah. I mean, that's always, the case with success. I mean, you got to put yourself out there to get lucky. And they were certainly doing that.
Yeah. Don't they say that preparation meets opportunity equals luck? That's what they always
Yeah. Yeah. You definitely can't discount the luck part of the whole deal. That's for sure. But they were also, I would say, and this is the brilliant part, smart enough to recognize that they had gotten lucky and to exploit that further. So, I mean, some people can just get lucky and they're like, hum-de-dum-de-dum. And they just go on and keep doing whatever they were doing. But these guys, and in particular, I would have to say Yakima Chief has really done a great job at taking advantage of the great position they were in. And that all comes down to them having some really smart people working there and owning the company or in control of the company. So I know people who read my articles are probably going to be surprised to hear me complimenting Yakima Chief, but that's not the only thing they deserve compliments on. But I'll have people ask me why I hate Yakima Chief so much. And I don't hate Yakima Chief at all. And they had when I tell people that, they say, well, you're always criticizing them in your articles. And I say, no, it's not that at all. They're just more vocal about everything. They have a way more developed marketing program, which means they say a lot more stuff. They put a lot more stuff out there publicly. And the other guys are quiet. And so there's just, and I use publicly available information for the articles I write and for the analyses I do. So that gives me a lot of material to work with. And inevitably there's contradictions, there's lies, there's misdirection, there's, people are people. And, of course you don't call them lies in marketing. It's marketing from your perspective. So
it's not rare to hear of a company saying things and doing things slightly differently. It's only a part of the truth.
Well, and that's the funny thing with American hops is all of them will say they have the best hops, which is kind of ridiculous because there's only like 70 growers. And so all of them probably get their hops from the same sources. It just goes through different venues. And yeah, there's good and bad hops. There's no doubt about it.
No, yeah, it's really interesting though. I was wondering if you could explain just maybe like the key supply chain layers. So of course, I think most people understand the whole farmer, merchants, brewers model, I guess, but maybe it's quite interesting you said earlier there's only 70 farms. Maybe just explain what those levels look like from each of their perspective.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, so there, like I said, there's 70 farms. That's also, that's a publicly available number. It was published in the Birth Report a couple of years ago, and it stayed the same. If I was saying how many decision makers there are in the industry, there's less. There's quite a bit fewer than 70, but that's a different subject, and that's not documented anywhere. That's one of those things you just kind of have to know from being involved that, oh, this guy controls that farm. Oh, he also controls that farm. Okay, that makes sense. But on paper, there's a lot more farms than there are in reality decision makers. So one thing that's interesting about these farms, and this isn't often said, but it's no secret. It's a club. If you're a hop farmer in the U.S., I don't want to make it sound ridiculous, so I'll try to keep the hyperbole down to a minimum. But it's like almost, it's, I don't want to say it's an elite group, but it's a very closed group of people that, on the one hand, they look out for each other. On the other hand, they're all competitors, so they hate each other. It's kind of a crazy dynamic there. There's definitely cliques within the group itself. Of course, you have the geographic differences. Washington dominates the whole thing. Oregon and Idaho are much smaller. So yeah, you have these farmers, and there used to be a divide between farmers and merchants. And I would have to say that's gone now. I think the farmer, almost every farmer, I mean, I can think of a few exceptions to this, of course, but a large majority of the farmers are involved in a merchant or sell direct to brewers. So it's not such a clear line between farmer and merchant anymore.
And is that the case for all merchants? Because obviously there's one that is farmer owned. And so, but are you saying that the others are very similar models?
No. Yeah, the others are owned outright by families that have owned them for a while. But you'll have so the farms in the United States are massive compared to the farms in Europe. And to give some perspective, so like a large farm in Germany, for example, would be 200 to 250 acres, about 100 hectares or so. Here in the United States, well, it's the smallest farming unit you'd see would be maybe 3 times that size, but there are farms that are 10 times that size. So you have different dynamics. There's different things that become possible when that's the case. And I've traveled around the world a lot, and I've met a lot of farmers all over the place. A lot of Germany, for example, if you go there during the summer, there's a good chance you're going to catch the guy who owns the farm on his tractor out in the field doing something, because that's how it is. And that was the case with a few of the American farmers when I started 20 years ago. I doubt anybody's out on their own tractor now. These are multi-million-dollar companies. They're huge corporations. Some of them make $100 million a year or more. These aren't farms. These aren't your stereotypical farms. Let's say that. They're big corporations, and they employ a lot of people. And so you have all that corporate structure that you would expect with a big corporation like that. And that's not to say, some of the older people that are involved in the farms, when they were younger, it was still that way. But their kids, especially the ones that have gotten involved in the last decade or so, I don't think they have that same experience that their parents had. And that makes them very different from their parents. Of course, the older generation survived some really, really nasty times, and so they know how to get scrappy and how to how to do things to survive. They know how to cut corners here and there without cutting quality, and so I expect. I mean, that we'll probably talk about this a little later, but I expect that's the kind of thing that we're going to see in the next few years as the current surplus works its way through the market. But the main thing that will define what's a successful merchant in the future is the ownership of proprietary varieties, in my opinion. And of course, that could change if all the brewers decide, hey, we don't want proprietary varieties anymore. Then there would be a movement back towards public varieties, because at the end of the day, the merchants will only sell what the brewers want, but the merchants promote the varieties they own over all the other varieties.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that they don't, they promote other varieties like public varieties, but I would be surprised if you see Haas promoting Lemon Drop, because that's a Steiner variety. You just wouldn't, we wouldn't expect to see that.
Yeah. Proprietary hops, from my understanding from your writings, Doug, but when I was reading it, it's like kind of funny how the hop market sort of simulated most other markets where, they basically tried to find ways of differentiating and protecting the company, because I think as you said, as the millions and quite staggering amounts of money started to generate from hops. I mean, I could be wrong on this, Doug, but I feel like the craft beer movement really accelerated the price of hops quite substantially, which means they've become much more valuable. So I feel like then people are like trying to scrap around to make sure that they have their stake in the market, and having proprietary on brands within that is exactly kind of is how most markets end up working in the end.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. The correlation between the development of the craft brewing market and the increase in prices. I wouldn't say the craft brewers wanted to pay more for the varieties. I would think the way I would say it is you had, in a really, really short amount of time, like let's say I remember the numbers from 2006, 2008, there were around 1,000 craft brewers in the U.S. And then, of course, that jumps up to 10,000 by 2020-ish. And so you have a lot of people with a little experience and very little understanding of how the hop market works. And that's just ripe for exploitation. That sounds terrible to say it that way, but those are the people who and most of them, this is nothing, I'm not knocking craft brewers, but they're busy brewing beer. They're doing 10 other jobs because, a small brewer owns the brewery. He's ordering stuff. He's probably cleaning out tanks. He's doing all the paperwork and all kinds of stuff. That's not every brewer, but that's probably several thousand of the 9,700 that exist today. They're probably in that boat, and they don't have time to invest in learning how the hop industry works. Whereas you get a big brewery like Heineken or Carlsberg, they have a person who just does that. They just do procurement. And so some of them understand the hop industry as well as anybody in the hop industry, because they've made it their job to do that. And they have access to pretty much any information they want because of their size. And so there's this huge inequality between customers. And so what happened while the craft beer industry was developing is, you had all those proprietary varieties developing at the same time together with it. Yeah, and they were looking for new flavors and all sorts of things. And so they marketed these hops, the proprietary varieties, to them. And in the beginning, like let's say 2013, 14, 15, a lot of craft brewers were just trying to get Cascade, Centennial, and Chinook. I mean, those are the varieties that kind of built the craft industry. But then those, fell out of fashion as the proprietary varieties rose in popularity. And then you have a really different dynamic that happened. I trying to think how much detail to give here, but I heard, let's just say it this way. I heard a merchant say one time in a public meeting in Germany that the best situation would be if we could control the production of hops to have just a slight deficit every year, but not so much where it would create a panic or a shortage, but just enough to keep the prices high. And, definitely no surplus. We don't want that. And if you look at what happened, that's what happened. That's exactly what happened from about 2012-ish or 13 or so until they started reducing acreage just a couple of years ago. They managed the supply of the proprietary varieties in such a way that it would justify getting the prices they wanted to receive. And that's brilliant. That's really smart. It's a little bit nasty, and it definitely isn't treating. I mean, it's definitely clear whose interests that serves, but that's what happened. And then there were one time I know of that it was a huge volume of overproduction of proprietary varieties, and that was extracted to take it off the market. So that means it was sold at the extract price, which was several times lower than what the craft market was going for. But a lot of these craft, varieties that are popular with craft breweries, the Roma varieties, have high alpha also. So they were sold, and I'm talking like 1 million pounds of hops taken off the market at super cheap prices and extracted so that the price of those aroma varieties could stay strong in the aroma market. That's not very nice. And that's not very genuine and honest. And I don't know. I mean, it's the people who own the varieties looking out for their own interests above all else. And I think that's the common thread.
I was thinking when you were talking about it, one of the main reasons I think that craft brewers ended up paying more for hops is because really acted as their differentiation between themselves, other breweries, the macro beer that was the big popular beer at the time, which is kind of what craft beer was rising up against in a way. I definitely mentioned that on a couple of pods before. And, hops are a huge part of that. Probably the emphasis on hops is too great and always kind of has been within the brewing community or craft brewing community. But, they're looked at in such a different regard to, I don't know, let's say, one of the macro brewers, for example, because what they're getting from their hops is very different to what craft brewers are getting from their hops. I think it probably is why people became so, dependent, I think is a word, which is probably fair. As much as there are some interesting alternatives to hops arising at the moment, but ultimately you take those, take aroma hops, American grown aroma hops away from craft beer, and you do end up with something that's going to be very, it's not going to be the same product that people are drinking and enjoying and have done, for a few years. So I think that's quite probably maybe where that came from.
Yeah, I agree. That's definitely a huge part of why. I mean, it's kind of a chicken and the egg sort of thing. Did craft explode first, or did the proprietary varieties?
One couldn't do it without the other.
Right. But I would argue that it could be done without proprietary varieties. It just takes a little bit of work. So I'm no brewer at all. I've never brewed a whole batch of beer, But over the last year, what I did is I created an algorithm to measure the oils in hops and then create blends to simulate popular proprietary varieties in the US. And then so what I did was I took Coors Light because it's a nice base beer.
Mm-hmm.
There's not much, no offense to the Coors people who are probably listening to this, but it's not like an IPA or anything. There's not a ton of hoppy flavor in there. And so it makes a good base beer. And then I dry hopped it at different rates with the blends that I created. And then I did that for 72 hours at room temperature. And then I chilled it back down and I ran it past a tasting panel that I put together of people who knew way more about brewing than I did. And out of all the recipes I put together, there are 10 that I think are, or that the tasting panel thought would make great IPAs, or they're good flavors in there. So it's possible, but that's not something that every brewer is going to take the time to experiment with. And it's complicated. So some of the blends I have, so I put some constraints on my little research project. I decided no proprietary varieties can be in there, and try to use as many hops not produced in the Pacific Northwest as possible. So I used there's Centennial in there, which could be sourced in the Pacific Northwest, but there's a lot of Slovenian varieties. There's some really exciting newer Slovenian varieties like Fox and Wolf is the most popular one, but there's Dragon and there's some pretty obscure ones, and they have amazing flavors. So, there's not much of them, but they're there. But who's promoting those? There's probably some smaller independent merchants that do mention that they have those and try to sell them. But I think it'd be a pretty safe bet that they don't get the promotional power that something like Citra Mosaic has from those companies that own those.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so it's possible to do it. But some of the blends that I put together have like 8 or 10 different varieties in them. And that was necessary to make it work from an oil perspective. And so it's possible that it could happen, but it's going to be difficult. And I'm not interested in becoming a merchant again. So I was just doing that to satisfy my own curiosity. And I did. Ultimately, the demand comes from the brewers, and that's definitely a chicken egg sort of situation. But I think what happened in the last, since 2012 is you had all these new brewers. A lot of people got in just for the money that was going around because there was tons and tons of money selling beer. Breweries were growing like crazy. And not everybody was as into brewing as you'd think. There were also a lot of brewers that probably didn't know brewing as well and got really lucky that the IPA trend was happening, because that can hide a lot of sins in a beer. It's hard to brew a nice clean lager or a Pilsner. But in an IPA, boy, you just dump some more hops in there and Bob's your uncle. But not bagging on brewers or anything. That's what everybody wanted to drink. So that's great. But I think it was easy to be lazy and just throw a bunch of Citra in something or Mosaic in something and then stick the name of the variety on the label and then sell it. And it sold. And so how amazing is that? Why wouldn't you do that if you're a new brewer just getting your feet wet? That totally makes sense. I would have done that too. I think that's what led to the increasing demand and the increased price for those varieties. It was a combination of things. So it was managed supply. It was demand that was growing by leaps and bounds every year. There was also kind of a frantic feeling in the industry around 2013, 14, 15, that time. I remember, I think it was 2015, Bart Watson from the Brewers Association at the Hop Growers of America convention said that they expected the craft beer industry to be 20% of the American beer market by 2020. And so I was in the audience at the time and just start calculating and say, okay, yeah, that's going to be a ton of hops that need to go in if that's the case. And boy, that drove contracts, that drove prices, that drove a lot of stuff. So it was all wishful thinking. I think it's still probably at 13% or something of the U.S. market. And it's something like that. I don't think it ever went over 13%. I might be mistaken on that, but it definitely never got near 20%. And so when that kind of thing happened, it kind of created a little chaos in the market, a lot of irrationality, let's say. And then people started doing stupid things, myself included. I'm not pointing the finger at other people. I did plenty of stupid things myself, probably more than my fair share.
So in your writing, so you talk a lot about the hop market surplus. So I think that'd be really good to go over, like, firstly, just high level, what that means, just so everyone understands, and maybe why it came about, and if we can even go to like how that affects the market, and probably more from the brewer's perspective, but how that affects the market for them.
Yeah, sure. So I guess start really basic. So there's an enormous surplus of hops right now. This year and last year, farmers here in the United States have been trying to, well, it hasn't been up to the farmers actually, that farmers have been told to reduce acreage of proprietary varieties that they're growing, because the farmers themselves don't actually have the choice whether they can grow those varieties or not. They're given permission through licensing agreements from the companies that own those varieties to produce them or not. And so that can be revoked and it can be regulated. And that's what's happening right now. So there are tens of millions of pounds surplus in the United States alone. Last year, Alex Barth at the Hop Growers of America convention mentioned that there was between 30 and 40 million pounds surplus varieties. And I think that's a conservative figure. I thought it was conservative then, meaning on the low side. And I think it's still on the low side today. The problem is the surplus actually began, I would argue, in 2016 or 2017, around that time. And you have Louis Gimbel from Steiner Company in 2018 at the Hop Growers of America convention saying that there was a surplus at that time. So that supports that idea. But the hype or the excitement behind the proprietary varieties that were gaining in popularity so quickly at that time, like Citra, Mosaic, those varieties, hop breeding company varieties, brewers kept signing contracts for them and they kept selling. And so you can have a contract, but at the end of the day, that's just a piece of paper. It's a very valuable piece of paper to some people, but a lot of merchants will joke that hops aren't sold until the money's in your bank account. That's when you've sold some hops, not until then. And so a contract doesn't represent a sale. A contract represents an agreement to sell or buy. And I think that's always been something that smaller independent hop merchants understood, because those are the ones that they have a greater risk of brewers not following through with the contracts they've signed. And the reason I say that is because it's easy to burn a tiny bridge, but you definitely don't want to burn a bridge with somebody as big as Yakima Chief or Haas or Steiner. So they've always been a little bit insulated from that world, and lucky them. But that changed in the last 5 years. And not that people bailed on their contracts or didn't honor their contracts, but the payments slowed and the deliveries slowed. And then they started to be, a year of hops that would pile up. And then the next harvest comes along, and then there's more hops that aren't going to get taken, but they're all contracted. So that's the situation that created the huge surplus we have today, is nobody really wanted to admit that on the larger end of the merchant scale, they didn't want to admit, or maybe they didn't believe that these contracts that they had were not going to be fulfilled or were too optimistic. And so they kept going with them, and they kept encouraging is a nice way to say it, but they kept demanding that brewers sign contracts. And there's always kind of this passive aggressive implication that, without a contract, you don't get the hops. Without hops, you don't make beer. So that's always just beneath the surface. And the hop farmers know that. And so do the merchants. They know that the biggest fear of any brewer is not being able to get hops. And that works to their advantage. And so they used that in the past decade to force breweries to sign contracts. And I think ultimately that begins at the farmer level. And like we discussed a little bit ago, the line between farmers and merchants is really blurred. So that's like saying it starts at the merchant level. But so when I write my articles, I oftentimes will put like merchant/farmer, because there's not much difference between the two. You have that situation, which is really, at the end of the day, it's greed. And I've been there myself. And so I know what that feels like. If you have a brewer who's willing to sign a contract with you, why wouldn't you sign that contract with that brewer? I mean, they know what they're doing, don't they? They're supposed to. Why would they sign a contract for hops they don't need? It's not my responsibility to tell them what they need.
Yeah, it's such a difficult situation. I actually did an episode on hop contracting right at the very start. And
I listened to it, yeah.
I've done a lot of thinking about it since that episode, actually, probably more than I probably should have. But I think it's so difficult for a brewer to actually contract correctly, or to be honest, even in a ballpark figure, because not only do you have to predict your business growth, which is, okay, you could probably have a fairly good grasp on your sales growth, and your channels, and you can make an educated guess. But then you got to understand your brand growth, because at the moment, each beer probably has a different blend of, I'm going to use the word proprietary hops, but could be any hops. But you have, and so you're thinking, okay, I've now got to predict the actual split of my sales growth. Which one's going to grow more, which one's going to grow less. And then you also have to be somewhat aware of macroeconomic factors. What's going to influence the market?
Yeah.
What's the market doing at the moment? Has it been on, what was the growth last year as a whole? And a lot of that information isn't available. And I'd say nearly everything I've just said is basically a prediction, which means you are going to be out on at least 1 to 2 of those things. And that's totally understandable. And then that has such I think often people are optimistic. I think they think they're going to grow quite considerably, and then something happens and they don't so much. But that effect has such a knock-on effect down the supply chain, because you've now got exactly what you said, you've now got the merchant who sat there with his contract. I think their level of responsibility of what they should accept as a contract is a very good question. I mean, it's difficult, right? If a pub goes to I'll just take it into a brewer's term, because if a pub comes to you and said, can I have 1,000 kegs off you? What do you do in that situation? Do you go, are you sure you need 1,000 kegs? That's quite a lot of kegs. Or do you go,
yeah,
absolutely, let me get the production rolling. I'll have you those 1,000 kegs in X amount of time. And I find it quite interesting. because then obviously, as you say it, and it makes a lot of sense, that farmer merchant line is very blurred. There's very little farmer to brewer interaction, and there's no real way of them sort of negotiating with them. So there always is that farmer merchant block. But how avoidable is it? So how do you think that the market should look if contracts were not, a part of it?
Yeah, I like your 1,000 keg example. The way to liken that even more to the hop industry is to ask that same guy, well, are you going to need 1,000 kegs next year and for the next 5 years too? Because we'll sign you up right now.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not going to give you the 1,000 kegs this year unless you sign that contract.
Yeah.
And yeah, how ridiculous would that be? Because obviously the tastes change, people's preferences change really fast in the craft industry. I mean, West Coast IPAs are popular right now. How long will that last? Who knows?
Exactly.
And,
how do you know?
last year lagers kind of took off.
Yeah.
Who knows what's going to be next? Next summer it could be a totally different thing. Sours were popular for a while. So there is really no good way to contract. But contracts weren't designed for craft brewers in the first place. So they really don't have any business being in that business. So it makes a lot more sense for the companies like Anheuser-Busch and Heineken, and even some of the larger craft brewers now, Stone and those guys. But for a tiny craft brewer, to force them to sign a contract is a little ridiculous. But it's not the merchant's fault necessarily, because it comes from the farmer. And the farmer is in a different world. Yeah, I don't mean that as an insult. They live in a much more fixed asset world. They have all these acres that are a long-term investment. Trellis, which is a huge long-term investment. They plant plants that'll last a long time. And so they want to see that stability. So it makes sense that from the farmer side, they want contracts, as long as they'd want 10-year contracts if they could get away with it. But that's not, there are long-term contracts like that, but that's not the norm. But there are some German growers that have contracts until 2030 that I know of that are really regretting that because of inflation. So yeah, the contract comes, the impetus for that is the farmer. And I've written about this too, when you realize how much money is involved in that contract, you definitely can't hold it against the farmer for wanting that. And I don't mean the profit, although that's good too, but I mean the financing for the farm. All the contract value is the basis for the operating line of credit that the farm uses to grow those hops. Because everybody has grown beyond their means, they can't afford to produce hops without a loan, and the bank wants some collateral for that loan. So that's why the push for contracts. It's all about money, and not the profit money, but the stability money. So that makes sense. You can't really fault them for that, but and that makes a lot of sense when you're dealing with 40 brewers that control 90% of the world's beer production. For those guys, that totally makes sense. But for the 40 smallest craft brewers, that doesn't make sense at all.
Yeah.
There's no reason, even the 4,000 smallest craft brewers in the US, it still doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I don't disagree with you at all, Douglas, but thinking on the other side, if we were to have a debate about it, would be, but on the other side, for contracting, if brewers didn't contract, and let's say, they didn't, for whatever reason, farmers didn't fully understand how much, and they didn't get these lines of credit, so they didn't know how much they were going to plant, and they didn't get the investment, then there would be a shortage on the other side, because then the farmers were obviously going to be very conservative with the amount they plant, because they're going to be extremely keen on getting 100% of their hops sold, which would create a shortage in the market. And is that worse or the same level of negative effect as a surplus on the brewer at the end? Because to me, if there's a shortage, then that's where panic starts to set in. Because as I go back, if you do have a popular brand and you are handcuffed to those varieties, which a lot of brewers are, completely separate to whether I think they should be or not, but a lot of brewers are like handcuffed to certain varieties and their brands, it's what they rely on. Is it not slightly more beneficial to have a surplus than a shortage, or is that not really an argument?
No, I agree with you. Yeah, you need, like we said before, the brewer needs to know that he's going to have the hops that he needs. So there's kind of therein lies the problem, really. So the ideal situation would be a relationship between whoever's buying and whoever's selling, and no formal contract that locks in price and quantity. And you're seeing, like, Yakima Chief is moving more in that direction now with their action plan.
Yeah, it looks really good there.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I would say they have what I was going to say is they have no choice but to do that, because there's no incentive for people to sign contracts right now. But because there's so many hops available.
Doug, just to give the listeners an understanding what the action plan is, a very high overview in case you haven't seen it, because it's quite new at the time of this recording anyway, in the UK. Basically, you contract on a volume rather than volume and variety. So let's say and then you can move that variety around. So you can, let's say you contract a ton, then you can that's a ton of hops, whatever variety, that you can split the varieties however you like. So it's a different way of contracting. Rather, I think the more traditional method is you contract, several varieties and volumes of those varieties.
I suppose that's it. I think you do lock in what you think, as far as variety wise, what you think you're going to need, but they allow flexibility between that. So you can change it. And then I'm looking at their website right now. It says 20% leniency, no fees.
Okay.
So I'm guessing you can change the volume even down,
it's good.
By 20%. Yeah. So it's a good start. Why are they doing that? Why didn't they do that in the last 10 years? Why aren't they applying these terms retroactively to their contracts that they have existing already? It's because they didn't have to. Now they have to. They're it's going to be their turn in the barrel for the next few years. And so this is whoever came up with this idea is really smart. This is a brilliant idea, because the alternative is no contracting. So this is a great way to get people to sign up for something, some kind of commitment, and it gets the conversation started. And I'd be really surprised if the other merchants don't follow in line with this just now while the market is so bad. Once it changes again, I think you see things like this go away. This is not something that's going to last if there's even a hint of a shortage on the horizon. This'll be yesterday's news. But they have to give the brewer some incentive to sign up, and they have to look like they're being fair. And this looks like a much more fair offer than, your traditional hop contract, for sure. So why weren't they being fair in the past? I wonder. It's because follow the money. It's always about money. They made more money doing what they did in the past. They didn't need to do this. Now this is the way to make money, because if you try to force those harsh contracts onto people, good luck with that right now. That's not going to happen. Some of the terms and conditions I'm not talking just about Yakima Chief, but some of the terms and conditions I've heard in the industry now don't even let the brewer sell the hops that they bought to a third party. That sounds kind of ridiculous to me. But if somebody signed that contract, then that's the rule of the contract. But those are the kind of draconian rules they've been playing by. I think money is just driving these decisions. And since interest rates have gone up so much, I'm sure the bank's gotten involved in the discussion. And that's why brewers are having to pay for their hops before they leave the warehouse now, because the bank doesn't want to lose that asset and replace it with just a promise to pay. They want to replace it with cash. So
Yeah, especially as the market sort of plateaus and cash flow
yeah,
becomes more of an issue for most business breweries and businesses within that plateau. I can see why people would want money up front. I don't find that yeah, especially I mean
no,
there's been
that's totally reasonable.
yeah,
Yeah, it
it's
makes sense.
reasonable.
But I bet I mean, that's never been the case in the past. The hop industry has always financed the brewing industry to some degree. And the longer those payments hang out there, the more expensive that financing becomes. And so when you have $1 billion worth of hops sitting in storage in Yakima, and there's, let's say, 6 to 8% interest on that, that gets your attention real quick. And then things have to start changing. I think that's what's motivating a lot of the things that are happening right now. And so, yeah, this is just a great way to get people to sign a contract, to keep them from going completely to the spot market.
So the spot market is really interesting market, so the open market, but that's not necessarily true because the open market is controlled by the same merchants who contract. Am I correct?
Oh yeah.
There's
Sorry.
no open market. So I think this is where I find it really interesting with the whole fact. How long is the surplus? When did the surplus start, Doug? Just
Well, I would argue it started in 2017 or so, but it became, or let's say it came to the awareness of everybody just about a year or two ago. That's when it was officially admitted by everybody.
but you can
So,
still, in those times, plenty of brewers I know, and myself included, struggle to find certain varieties. I mean, I can't say that surplus is on every single variety. I'm completely aware of that, but there
yeah,
was an
yeah.
element of I'm glad I remember there's a few times I'm glad we have a contract because I'm looking at the open market and it doesn't look healthy in terms of varieties and price, etc. But it's unusual to me, thinking with my economic hat on, why if there's a surplus, there's also a shortage at the same time. If from a brewer's perspective, if they can't find certain
Hmm.
varieties, so
Yeah.
in that sense, I mean, I don't want to go into why that is because I think people fairly can piece two and two together on that one maybe. But how long do you think this surplus will last? What is the solution to the surplus?
Yeah. But let me touch on one thing real quick before I answer that. So the surplus in one variety, shortage in another, is is a result of that lack of commodification or commoditization, whatever the proper word would be, uh, of the hops themselves. The branding that's in place
Mm,
now is so much stronger than it used to be. And so, yeah, every variety is its own market. And some of the smaller varieties are more susceptible to being short. So, yeah, you wouldn't want to apply the same strategy to every variety. That said, the shortage is massive. Last year, I think most people believe at the beginning of last year, most people believed it was limited to the most popular proprietary varieties. And now I think it's become apparent that it's much, much worse than that. It's widespread across almost all the varieties. There's a mountain of New Zealand varieties sitting in warehouses all over the world. There's German varieties that there's surpluses. I mean, it's almost as if the whole brewing industry bought too much of everything for whatever reason. And of course, that's, there's undergoing their own changes right now. So that could be part of it. But so it's widespread across all countries and all varieties. And so they're all going to come back into balance at their own rate. So it's really complicated. But that said, there's going to be a surplus of hops, I would say, at least the next 3 years. And alpha is a different story. Alpha, there's a surplus now, and the production of alpha is growing. So I don't know. That's an opportunity actually for a lot of smaller brewers. I would think they'd want to try to start using alpha because that's the area the of the industry that's still plays by commodity rules for now. And they could save a lot of money if they use that at the beginning of the boil, at least for the bitterness, early on. They don't, and finish off with, or dry hop with something with more flavor, depending on what they're looking for. But so there's strategies there that could be implemented to save a lot of money, I think. So yeah, I would expect the surplus to be long lasting, several years at best. So this year at the Hop Growers of America convention, the word went out again from a Haas person that farmers need to take out another 10,000 acres of hops. That's what they said last year. Of course, they said 10,000. I think they actually took out 9,000 and then planted another 4,500 back in. So the net was only about 4,000 or 4,500, somewhere in there. I think closer to 4,000. So they're not good at taking out, or they're not good at downsizing. The hop industry is bad at that. And that goes back to all those fixed assets they have. They're going to be less efficient if they downsize, and everybody wants their neighbor to downsize first. So they don't want to be the one.
This might be maybe a silly question, but where does that surplus actually exist? So we're talking, 10 million pounds. By the way, this has all been in weight, just to get me for the UK listeners.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. We don't work in pounds.
Yeah, not pounds sterling.
Not pounds in terms of good old cash. It's pounds in weight.
Yeah.
So where does this surplus actually physically exist? Is it? I mean, obviously some of it exists in the brewers. I know there's a lot of surplus hops in breweries. I assume some of it's in the merchant warehousing, but I guess where does that actually sit, and whose financial burden is that? Because that's got to be colossal.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of warehouses, cold storage warehouses in Yakima. They're all full. So
what are they going to do with them? Because surely that's you can't write that off. Well, can you?
Well, you can. At some point, that's what has to happen. So there's, I just saw an ad on, I think it was LinkedIn, might have been Instagram. BSG is the brewer supply group, is selling hops for as low as 25 cents a pound.
Wow.
For 2016 crop.
Oh, okay. There's always a cost somewhere.
Yeah. So what I would think, I don't know. I assume they store them properly because they do a good job 100%. At that kind of thing. So that's not an issue. But I would think even being stored properly, there's some degradation, and probably significant degradation, in hops that old. So if I was somebody wanting to buy those hops, I'd ask for a test. I'd want to know the alpha. I'd want to know the oils that are left in there, because there could be very little left. And that's the problem you get with really old hops. And that brings up a misconception most brewers have, is that you have to have the most current crop year hops. Everybody wants the freshest hops. And that's, a lot of merchants have sold that as being a huge advantage. Only the freshest hops. Get your fresh hops here. Yeah. Fresh hop ale, all kinds of stuff. But the reality is, hops can sit for a couple of years, maybe even 3 or 4 years, and you won't notice any difference in them if they've been stored properly. It's all, based on that. If they've been stored properly, which all the big merchants do. They all do that very well. That's not an issue. So if you're buying pellets that have been stored properly, you want to do some homework, make sure they didn't sit around as bales for 3 years before they were pelleted, because then they're probably going to be garbage. But if they were pelleted right after harvest, which most everything is, then, and if they were, stored in the nitrogen foils and kept cold and all that stuff, the normal routine, the hops are going to be really good. And you can save a ton of money buying hops that are a year or two old.
I was just about to say that's a really good, it's such an interesting point, and one that I think debated quite a lot between brewers. what really is the value of that fresh latest variety, because the cost is pretty substantial. And,
Yeah.
I've seen the drop off in price, what people are willing to pay, which I guess ultimately is price, of hops that,
Mhm.
once, let's say 23 varieties hitting the market now, 22, people just aren't interested in as much, and the value of it goes, and the people are willing to pay less. And it just kind of like, it doesn't really make any sense to me, because I agree 100%. Once the hops are, as long as the hops have been stored well, 2-3 years
Mhm.
is certainly not a problem.
It's nothing. Yeah,
It's,
and
I
but
mean,
that is the key. They have to be stored properly,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
they are. If they're here in Yakima, they're stored properly.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know about everybody's practices, but the big guys for sure.
Yeah, I've seen the warehouses. They're flawless, really, aren't
Yeah.
they? I mean,
Yeah,
they're
they
really
are.
impressive.
Yeah, some of them you could eat off the floor in there.
Yeah.
So that's a huge opportunity for people to save money. And if they doubt it for a second, buy a 44-pound box and of a year-old crop or 2-year-old crop and have it tested, and then compare that to a fresh crop and see what the difference is. The problem with that is the crop is different every year. So the freshest crop is not always necessarily the highest quality.
Exactly
If there
correct.
was a bad year, you don't want the freshest crop. You might want last year's crop. And that happens more often than you'd know. So it's not just in the numbers. You have to know what kind of year it was. And you have to know what kind of year it was in the different region. I mean, way too much information for anybody to want to pay attention to, because you're busy brewing beer. But you can test those things and see what they are. And they have, for example, one statistic people might be familiar with is that hop storage index.
Of course.
Well, fresh hops can come off the farm with a high hop storage index of 0.3 or more, just based on how they were harvested, but they're fresh, and you could have hops a couple years old that are still at, 0.25 or something like that, a decent score, whatever, below 0.3. 0.3 is kind of the threshold people usually talk about, you don't want over 0.3. But even over 0.3, I would say that's not a deal breaker. A friend of mine was a merchant. He's not a merchant anymore, but he told me one time about a test he did with some Japanese brewers. And this was 20, 30 years ago. And I get that brewing or standards with regards to hops have changed in that time, but the example was funny. So he was trying to sell them American hops to Japanese brewers. Japanese breweries traditionally have bought Czech varieties or German varieties, more noble European varieties for their beers, and they still do. But by and large, but he wanted to try to sell them some American varieties, and so he sent a fresh batch and took samples of all the varieties they wanted and sent them over. And they hated it. They thought, oh, this is terrible. It's way too pungent. This is not the Japanese flavor preference. And what he didn't tell them is he cut the samples he sent in half, and he left the other half just in the back room at room temperature for about a month. And then he said, hey, I want you to try this batch. And so he sent them over those samples, and they liked those samples a lot more. So back in the day in Europe, hops used to sit around a lot before they made their way to the pellet mill. They'd sit on the farm in the barn because it usually gets cold within a month or so after harvest. And some hops still do sit around in a barn after harvest in Europe. And then they make their way into the warehouse, and then they get pelleted. And they have cold storage there now, but they've kind of copied the American system. But it's not. I mean, I guess the beauty is in the eye of the beholder kind of thing. The standard back in the day was more oxidized hops, that flavor that they give off. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It just depends
Yeah,
on
it depends on
the
what you're looking
consumer.
for.
Yeah, and so the standard today is everything is in cold storage like right away. And so nobody will ever get to experience that, that more oxidized thing. So so back to our freshness discussion, is they're still going to be fresh even 2 years down the road because they were packaged right away. And so that's an opportunity to save some money, a lot of money, I think. And
Yeah,
especially now when there's a surplus, you have all these sellers that are motivated to get rid of their inventory. So there's just more opportunities.
so I mean, this leads me on to probably I don't want to say the most important question, but what options do brewers have to navigate the current hop market?
Boy, that's really the big question. So yeah, I like the type of deal that Yakima Chief is offering. That's smart. I think if I were a bigger brewer and I needed to guarantee some of my volume, I would probably do something like that. I'm not endorsing that plan or anything. Don't get me wrong, but it seems like they're being more reasonable. But big brewers get what they want anyway. A big brewer doesn't have to be nice. They can dictate their terms because it's the volume they control. So my guess is that big brewers have been feeling this kind of stuff for a long time already. So it's the medium and small sized brewers that this really applies to. And honestly, I think if I were a small brewer, I wouldn't contract anything and just keep tabs on the market, on the varieties that I need, and just be aware if it looks like the surplus of that variety is drying up. And in the case of some of the varieties, there's so many hundreds of thousands of pounds of hops out there, or millions of pounds. It's going to take a little while for that to dry up. And in the meantime, the hops will still get produced. There's going to be less, but there's still going to be hops produced out there. I guess if I was a smaller or mid-sized brewer, I'd try to reduce my reliance on a single proprietary hop variety that somebody else owns, because then you're at their mercy. Really, I think I'd want to create something that, maybe there's 4 or 5 different varieties in the beer that I'm making. That way, if one of them is short one year, it's not the end of the world for me. And that would apply not just when there's a surplus, but even in a regular year, because there can be weather. So for example, like when it's super hot, Centennial doesn't do well. Cascade does really well. So, in any given year, certain varieties can perform poorly. And so I guess that would be a thing I would do, just to kind of create an insurance policy for myself to reduce my reliance on any one supplier. I'd want to make myself a little more bulletproof as far as that goes. But I think now brewers can just take advantage of this opportunity to get some supply that they need at lower prices, because the sellers are all motivated. We'll see more in the summer, but I haven't heard any trellis coming out yet. So that's really the true test, because people can take the plants out of an acre, out of a trellised acre. But when the trellis starts coming down, that's a pretty permanent change. And that's not happening yet. So I think as long as there's empty trellis that's going to be sitting around in Washington State or Idaho, supply is just a crop year away, whatever the variety is. So there's not a serious threat of a big shortage that can't be fixed. I guess what I mean is, you're not going to get, so let's say you don't contract anything, and you have to pay attention to what's going on. That's key. I mean, you don't want to just decide, I'm not going to contract anything and never again.
Doug told me not to contract, so I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, right.
It'll all be good next year.
Right. Now, if you're paying attention, then that's an okay strategy, because the signs that things are changing and that it's time to contract will come way before it's time to contract. So that would be a safe way to go forward, I think. And that's the best strategy I can think of that I would take if I were a brewer right now. And of course, if you have, if you feel more comfortable contracting, then do a contract, but not for like 100% of what you need.
Yeah.
Because you can always pick stuff up on the spot market. And actually, you asked that question about spot versus contract market before, and they're the same people that are offering spot sales versus contracted sales. Spot versus contracted just when you buy it and how long you buy it for. So like usually they're also contracts. So that's why it's confusing to some brewers, because you can sign a contract to buy hops this year, or you can go on Lupulin Exchange and just buy some hops. And those are both considered spot deals because there's no future years involved in them. So the terminology is a little confusing, but yeah, I would stick with spot and then stay informed on what's going on. Be aware when the market's changing. And that'll be, to people who know what's going on, that'll be pretty obvious. Volumes will come down, the older crop will go away, the acreage of certain varieties will start increasing again in response to shortage, because the big guys are paying attention to all this kind of stuff too. So yeah, I guess that's what I would do. And you mentioned a solution to the problem. I enjoy writing my articles and writing the reports, and I've had some criticism of the articles. They're way too long, and I agree. They are. Some of them are way, way too long.
That's what happens when it's passion, not work.
That's the problem. And I just enjoy writing them and I can't stop. But it is a problem that I recognize. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start charging for the MacKinnon Report, but there will still be a free version. The free version will have just short, abbreviated versions of the longer analyses that are in the paid version. But more than that, I'm not going to limit it to just hops. Like we talked about earlier in the conversation, there's a lot of different things that can affect the cost of a beer. And I've identified 23 different industries or different topics that, from an economic point of view, that can affect the cost of a beer. So things that brewers need to know that are, when they change, that affects their cost of production in a way where they should be paying attention to that. So as far as I understand, there are news aggregator services. This wouldn't be that, because I would be applying analysis to the news. So it's not just, copy and paste from Google. But I guess there's value in that too. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think the analysis and the 20 years of working with brewers in one way or another has helped me understand their concerns. And of course, my specialty, the thing I know the most about, is hops. But I've been spending a lot of time the last few months learning about all these other commodities and industries. And, it wasn't that long ago we had a shortage of CO2, glass, aluminum. Those are several other things that brewers should probably be keeping tabs on, because you can see those things developing before they get here. So stuff like that. And then, so I'm going to keep the subscription price pretty reasonable. I think $25 to $30 a month or so, which is going to be way more than some people want to pay for my opinion on anything. I get that. But to add some value to that, I'm going to add a layer to this thing. So I have all this experience with the trading hops and sourcing hops and all that. And I've come to an agreement with a supplier. I won't say his name because I don't want any of the stink that may be on me to wear off onto him, because I realize that some of the things I write are unpopular. But so what I want to do is, or what I plan to do, is for subscribers, for brewers that are subscribers, to do some sort of cooperative purchasing thing so they can take advantage of the prices that big brewers get, even though they're a small brewer. And that's not new. That's not rocket science or anything. But I'm not, the part that's different is I'm not going to add anything to it for myself. If you're a subscriber to the MacKinnon Report, that's enough for me. And so there won't be any extra commission that I'm making from the hops. The reason I want to do that is because I know the smaller brewers are the ones that are exploited the most. They pay the highest prices. Some of them pay, $15, $16 a pound. That's, when you put it in dollars per kilo, it just sounds like highway robbery, but it's expensive, and they could be saving $4, $5, $6, $8 a pound. It depends on the variety and the circumstances, and it's going to operate mainly on I don't want to say spot, but I want to do it in that way that I suggested, where the relationship is there. So it'll be spot because I don't want to get involved in contracts, and I don't think smaller brewers should be involved in contracts. So it'll be more spot oriented. But the main benefit is that cooperative negotiating of price, and then I think when there's enough brewers in a certain area, coordinating the shipping is also another huge way that brewers can save money.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, yeah, I've had more times than I can count. I've had brewers call, with an emergency. So we're brewing on Wednesday and it's Monday, and they don't have the hops they need. And so they need them overnighted across country in the US,
Yeah. I've definitely been the one giving that phone call a couple of times.
Oh, really? Yeah. And so I think that can be avoided if the people working together know that they have their best interests in mind. And not to say that the big merchants don't have some brewers' best interests in mind, but more often than not, they're not treated as well as they should be. And I want to do something about that. And I'm not trying to make a fortune doing this. That's why I think just the subscription rate is reasonable enough. I'd rather make a difference than make a fortune. And I think this will make a difference for a lot of brewers. It'll help them, especially with things getting more difficult, the economy and competition in the beer industry getting more difficult. I think this is an opportunity to make a change for some of them. And I see some big changes coming. So I think in the brewing industry, and so I think there's going to be some difficult times, especially for people in the middle. The big brewers are going to compete against each other on price for shelf space and all that. And then the little guys have an advantage because they have loyal customers that come to their pub or tap room or whatever. And so they can charge, they sell by the pint. But it's those people in the middle trying to do a little bit of this and a little bit of that are going to really have a hard time. And those are going to be the ones that'll probably end up either getting absorbed by some of the bigger guys or just go away. And we're seeing some of that happening already. But so I think there'll be a bottom and then a top and not much middle in there.
Doug, I'm going to say I will definitely be a subscriber of the new MacKinnon Report. You've got one right here, no problem. I really love the comment, by the way. I'd rather make a difference than a fortune. I think it's really good, and something I think I probably echo with my work as well outside of the podcast. So yeah, you'll definitely have a subscribe from me. I think but your writings are fantastic as I've said to you before. I actually mentioned, I think I mentioned anyway, on the first podcast on the hop contracting that I asked if they'd ever heard of this concept of cooperative ordering. And I spent a ton of time looking into it after as well. I said I really got fascinated by the Hoponomics. It's actually where, after the episode, that's where I found your articles. And yeah, I find it such an interesting concept, and it makes a lot of sense. I probably, this is my opinion, but I don't necessarily think that the market is all that broken. I think that maybe brewers just don't navigate it correctly. One of the things, that cooperative nature makes a lot of sense, and not just with hops, but actually with a lot of buying. It kind of just like taking what I looked into is a bunch of other markets that do a very similar thing, and a lot of the bigger players do it as well. They all club together and then they just buy as one. And you just sit there and you think, what, it just makes so much sense, especially in a community like the brewing community where everyone's really quite close. Why would we not buy together? Why would you not all then have a business side and a fun side? And you could save quite a substantial amount of money over the course of a year, like, 20-30% of costs of a lot of raw material costs by clubbing together. So I think it's a really fascinating thing that you're setting up. I'm going to be watching it with an extremely keen eye, just because I think it's, something that I personally believe makes so much sense. And I think it's great to hear that you're doing that. And as a part of the subscription, seems like even better.
Oh, yeah. And then the thing I like about it too is, like I mentioned, there's ways to see when trends are changing if you have somebody who's looking out for all that stuff. And that would be another way I could help these brewers. They don't have time to pay attention to 20 or more markets and all the changes that are happening in those markets. So, but they need that information. And one thing I wanted to mention too is it's not all about money. I've been down that road, and it leads nowhere. It's very empty. So if there's a brewer, a small craft brewer, let's say, and he genuinely can't afford that subscription rate, then just get in touch with me and we'll make it work. Because I don't want that to be the reason that somebody doesn't have access. That shouldn't be the reason. That's
I love that.
Nobody should be excluded. Yeah, I just want to help out.
Yeah, I love that, man. I really, Again, it echoes a lot of what I do as well. I'm always very much trying to look after the smaller brewer as well, because I know you mentioned right at the very start of the pod, I feel really passionately about is that I think as a brewer, more than what feels like most industries that I walk into, you're expected to do and know so much. You're like plate spinning so relentlessly. And then, people can spend a lifetime researching very specific parts of just brewing and not really get to the bottom of it. And you're expected to know that on top of everything else. It's really, it's such a tough, not a tough industry, because there's a lot for a small brewer to do and there's not a lot of resources. They're very stretched. So I always really appreciate anyone who looks out for them. So I think that's awesome, man. I really respect that.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Yeah, I'm looking forward to doing it too. It's, a lot of the smaller craft brewers I've met are just the nicest people in the world. And it's when they get to be bigger brewers that's not always the case, but because then it's a mix. But
then it turns into I always feel that things change when, you've always mentioned when that money gets higher and structures just have to, they have to. It's kind of how businesses become their own beings. They build these sort of corporate structures around them. And, then you're having, because that's how it protects itself and protects the people within it.
They lose their soul when they do that.
Yeah. And then it always comes at a cost of creativity in that, quick change of direction. Let's do this tomorrow, let's do that, because that flexibility is what small business really ultimately is, that creativity and flexibility. That does not work on a 100 million, 150 million, pounds or dollars a year scale, because it gets very reckless. And you've probably debt finance, you've probably got investors,
No, but I completely agree with everything you said. It's kind of, I know you're in England and all, but here in the US, people think of that as the American dream, to get rich doing what you love. But when you when the money gets involved, it loses something. And I think I call it the soul, but it just becomes about if you chase the money, it just becomes about the money then. And
Yeah.
that's,
it always has to when it gets to, that is capitalism.
I'd rather do something I love and make a lot less money than make a ton of money and hate my job.
Amen to that. So, Doug, for the listeners who haven't already jumped onto the MacKinnon Report and already hit subscribe, where can they find you? What's the best way of interacting with you, and how they find out more about this sort of future cooperative? I know a lot of my listeners are in the UK, so I don't know if what you're doing is going to apply to them straight away, but I feel like it's something that navigating the markets is pretty global in a sense, and we buy a lot from America anyway, especially hop-wise. So I still think there's a huge amount of value to be had there, especially going and reading about the hop market from a sort of an independent source. So where can they find out more information, and where can they find out more info on what you're going to be doing in the future with these cooperatives?
Well, yeah, thanks for asking. The articles I've been writing are over on Substack. So it's just look for MacKinnon Report on Substack, and I'm going to stay on Substack for this change too. There's options to do all kinds of stuff through Substack. So you can charge, there can be free and paid subscribers, there can be video, there could be a podcast. I think you're covering the podcast space good enough for now.
There's plenty of room, man, don't worry.
But there's all kinds of options, and so everything will be there. But I'm on all the social stuff at MacKinnon Report, and LinkedIn, I guess I would just be under my own name, Douglas MacKinnon. So,
yeah,
but everything's accessible through the Substack.
And that's how we started interacting as well. I read your articles, followed you on LinkedIn, and started messaging about certain things I found really interesting. So yeah, that's how this whole thing's developed. And he's real, from my point of view, is really approachable. So yeah, anyone who's listening should definitely drop him a follow on socials, and definitely just read those articles. I can't stress to you how well written they are and well researched and well cited. It's really interesting to see. So keep it up, man. I think it's outstanding. And as I said, you'll definitely have paid subscriber in me. That's 100%.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thanks for the opportunity to be on your podcast. Been fun.
Yeah, I can't believe that was your first one, Doug. You absolutely smashed it.
We had a good conversation. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. It's such a unique perspective on something that probably feels so far away, but so close all at the same time for a brewer. You're interacting with hops on a daily basis, but the macroeconomic market you probably never really know too much about, other than what you feel as the brewer, the contracting, the shortages, etc. But actually to get a bigger picture of it, I think is just so eye-opening and just really useful information, as you said, how you can use that to leverage better costs for your brewery and have better conversations maybe with suppliers. We've always got, whenever new markets come on, or we want to do it, if we get enough demand, we'll definitely can do a part 2. So if anyone's anyone wants to hear more about the hop markets from Doug, let me know. You can just hit me up and let me know. And if you found the episode interesting and you want to hear more, I can just run another one. It's absolutely no problem.
Yeah. And I'd be happy to do it anytime. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Doug. And take care, mate. And I'll speak to you very soon. Well, for me, one of the most fascinating episodes. I just loved it. I listened to it back, and I fell in love with it again. So a big thanks to Doug and everything that he does. I think such a fascinating guy and really well spoken. Can't believe that was his first podcast. Significantly better than my first. But yeah, the next episode is going to be on CO2 recapture, which is super exciting. Please make sure you hit the follow, subscribe button, and you will not miss the next episode of the Modern Brewer Podcast.